Don't bother showing up for the photos this year. You're not part of us anymore. That's how it started. No greeting, no explanation, just a clipped sentence from my sister-in-law over the phone, delivered with the same tone you'd use to cancel a subscription. I sat there, the receiver still warm in my hand, staring at the wall as if it might give me a better reason than she had. Outside, December light fell in cold stripes across my kitchen table. Inside, something heavier settled, something that didn't have a name yet, only a pulse. The family group chat lit up all week, plans bouncing back and forth like nothing was wrong. I wasn't in it anymore, of course. I'd been quietly removed months ago, a fact I had told myself didn't matter. But when the annual portrait came around, it did. It always did. That photo wasn't just an ornament for the mantle. It was proof of belonging. It was the yearly evidence that no matter the fights, the silences, the distance, you were still counted. And this year, they'd decided I wasn't. I might have stayed away, let them have their curated picture, the tidy version of our bloodline with all the unwanted edges cropped out. But then I got the message. A forwarded text from my cousin, short and almost apologetic. You probably already know. 3 words dangling like a hook. I didn't already know, but now I did. The session was set for Saturday morning, the same studio as always, the same photographer who'd watched us all grow older through her lens. They were planning to take that picture without me standing in it. I read the message again and again until the edges of my phone case dug into my palm. I could almost hear the click of the camera in my head, the flash bleaching out the truth that I'd been erased. I imagined them lining up, my own son's arm draped over someone else's shoulder, my chair pulled out of frame, my absence stitched into the family's visual history. It was like watching a memory you're still alive to feel get rewritten in real time. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This way, you're helping us grow the channel and bring you more stories like this. All right, let's continue. So I made a decision. I didn't tell them I was coming. I didn't ask for permission. If they wanted to leave me out, they were going to have to do it to my face. And as I zipped my coat that morning, I realized it wasn't about a photo anymore. It was about standing where they didn't want me and making sure the picture they took told the whole truth, whether they liked it or not. The morning of the session came colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you second-guess every decision. I left early, long before anyone else would have started getting ready. The streets were quiet, the frost still clinging to car roofs, the air sharp enough to make each breath visible. My steps echoed on the pavement, slow and deliberate, as if each one was a small declaration that I still had the right to be there. I didn't take a bus or a cab. I wanted the walk. I wanted to feel every block between my door and the studio, to let the cold strip away whatever hesitation still clung to me. With each step, I rehearsed nothing, no speech, no argument, just silence, the kind of silence that can't be mistaken for weakness. The building came into view, its old brick facade darkened by years of winter rain. The glass door reflected a version of me I wasn't sure they'd recognize. Coat buttoned to the neck, gloves on, shoulders back. No announcement, no call ahead, no text to say I was on my way. I wanted my arrival to be as unshakable as a shadow. They'd see me only when they looked up and realize I had been there the whole time. Through the window, I caught sight of them already gathered in the waiting area. Laughter, movements, small adjustments to scarves and ties. A picture-perfect warmth I had been told I didn't deserve. And yet, there I was, my hand on the door handle, the thin metal cold against my palm. When I stepped inside, the change was immediate. The air smelled faintly of coffee and the powdery scent of the studio backdrop. A heater hummed in the corner. Conversation faltered for just a breath, like the room itself had inhaled sharply. Eyes lifted toward me, some startled, some narrowed, others pretending not to notice at all. I didn't offer a smile. I didn't offer anything. I hung my coat on the rack as if it belonged there, then took a seat on the edge of the room where the light fell across my lap in a long, pale strip. They didn't say I was welcome, they didn't say I wasn't, but I was there, and for the moment that was enough. They saw me before I spoke. It was the kind of noticing that doesn't require words. Just a shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a small tightening around the mouth. My presence broke whatever easy rhythm they'd been in. One moment they were arranging themselves, adjusting collars, brushing imaginary lint from each other's shoulders. The next, there was a subtle but undeniable ripple, as though someone had thrown a stone into still water. The first glance was from my nephew, quick and unguarded, like a child seeing something unexpected in the corner of a room. Then his mother, my sister-in-law, caught sight of me. Her face didn't change much. The expression was all in the eyes. They flicked toward the makeup table, toward her husband, toward anyone else who might share her quiet alarm. It was the look people get when an uninvited guest steps into a photograph that was already framed in their mind. I sat there, not moving, letting the moment stretch until it was almost uncomfortable. I could feel the questions buzzing silently in the air. Who told you? Why are you here? Do you really think you belong in this? They didn't ask them out loud, and I didn't answer. Silence became my armor, my refusal to shrink. My sister-in-law shifted her weight, turning slightly away as if my being here required immediate damage control. She spoke to someone near the coat rack, not looking directly at me, her voice low and clipped. The rest of the family reacted in small, telling ways. Someone suddenly busy checking their phone, someone else flipping through a magazine they hadn't touched until now, a teenager pretending to scroll but sneaking glances in my direction. It wasn't open hostility. It was something colder, the kind of distance that makes you feel invisible while everyone still sees you perfectly well. The photographer was in the corner, testing her lights, snapping a few warm-up shots of the children. She hadn't noticed me yet, or maybe she had and was waiting to see if anyone would introduce me. No one did. I could almost sense the silent hope that if they ignored me long enough, I'd take the hint and walk out. But I didn't. I sat straighter, folding my hands in my lap, the faint hum of the heater filling the space where conversation should have been. And in that stillness, I realized something. They might see me as a complication, but complications are what make a picture real. Without them, it's just a staged arrangement, neat, polished, and dishonest. I wasn't going anywhere. When I finally rose to hang my coat, the air in the room seemed to shift behind me. I heard it before I saw it, the faint scrape of metal legs dragging across the wooden floor. By the time I turned back toward the set, the folding chair that had been resting at the far end of the row was gone, vanished in the quiet, efficient way someone hides an object they don't want noticed. It wasn't just a chair. It was the space they had no intention of leaving for me. The spot where, in another year, I might have been told to sit, half in the frame, half in the shadows, just close enough to be in the picture, but far enough to remind me of my place. Now even that token position had been removed. Someone, without looking at me, offered a casual explanation into the air. We're keeping it tighter this year. The words floated like dust motes, light but impossible to ignore. Tighter as if belonging could be compressed. Tighter as if family were a fixed measurement and I had overstepped the limit. I stood there for a moment, my coat still half on, feeling the invisible lines they were drawing around themselves, the deliberate shrinking of a circle I had once been inside. The set looked wrong without that chair, though I doubted anyone else noticed. The symmetry was gone. There was a faint imbalance in the arrangement, a subtle tilt you could feel if you stared long enough. I wondered if the camera would pick it up, if the lens could sense when a seat had been taken away, not just from the floor, but from the story. I slipped my coat onto the rack with deliberate care, as if the simple act of hanging it were a claim. My eyes traced the empty space where the chair had been, and I imagined myself filling it anyway, not because they offered it, but because I refused to vanish as quietly as they wanted. In that moment, I understood something important. They could remove a chair, but they couldn't remove the fact that I was already here, breathing the same air, occupying the same room. And no matter how tightly they tried to close the frame, there would always be a gap where the truth seeped in. She emerged from behind the backdrop, like a figure stepping out of a faded memory. Tall, with silver hair pulled into a loose braid, her hands already curled around the weight of an old camera that looked like it had seen decades of faces, births, weddings, reunions, and farewells. The leather strap was worn thin in places, the metal edges dulled from years of work. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed hundreds of families arrange themselves into fleeting, frozen moments. And who could read more truth in posture than in words? Her eyes found me almost immediately, and something softened there. Not surprise, not pity. Something gentler, deeper, like recognition. She walked toward me without hesitation, the lens swinging lightly at her side. Her presence felt different from the others in the room. They had looked at me as if I were a question mark hanging where there should have been a period. She looked at me as if I were a sentence that still had the right to be finished. "Hello," she said, her voice warm but unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world for this small exchange. She asked my name, not in the way people do when they're being polite, but in the way you ask because you want to keep it, hold it, use it correctly. I spoke it aloud, hearing how steady it sounded despite the weight in my chest. She repeated it, not once but twice, the syllables rolling easily off her tongue, each repetition pressing it more firmly into the air between us. Then, without looking away from me, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a narrow, dog-eared notepad. On the top line of a fresh page, in neat, deliberate handwriting, she wrote my name. She didn't abbreviate it, didn't misspell it, didn't let it trail off. Full, exact, as if she were recording a truth that might be forgotten if she didn't anchor it there. Something in me shifted at that. In a room where people had been working quietly to erase me, to tighten the frame, to remove the chair, to speak around me, here was someone who insisted with nothing more than ink and paper that I existed. It was a small act, almost invisible to the rest of them, but I felt the weight of it like a stone settling into my palm. She tucked the notepad back into her pocket and gave me a smile. Not the kind you give to smooth over tension, but the kind that says, "I see you, and you're staying right where you are." And in that moment, I realized that before a single picture had been taken, she had already given me something the rest of them wouldn't, a place that couldn't be cropped out. It started like the faint rustle of leaves in a still room, low voices curling into the corners, not meant to travel far, but sound has a way of finding the person it's meant to hurt. I was standing near the edge of the backdrop, my hands folded loosely in front of me, when the first phrase drifted over. "She hasn't been around much." The words were dressed in a tone that tried to sound factual, but I could hear the quiet satisfaction underneath, the way someone might point out a flaw in a garment they'd been waiting to notice. Another voice joined in, softer but sharper. "It's better this way." Better. The word slid under my skin like a splinter. Better for who? Better because the picture would look more symmetrical? Because the story they told themselves would go down smoother without me in it? I pretended to adjust the cuff of my sleeve, tilting my head just enough to catch more of it. They didn't know I was listening, or maybe they did and didn't care. Then came the final thread, almost a whisper, the kind of tone you use when you're wrapping something up so tightly no air can get in. "Let's not make it awkward." As if awkwardness were a worse sin than exclusion, as if the mere act of including me would somehow fracture the delicate balance they'd built in their heads. Every word tightened my jaw until I could feel the muscle ache. I kept my eyes fixed on a spot on the floor, a tiny imperfection in the wooden plank where the varnish had worn away. It became an anchor, something to stare at so I wouldn't have to see their faces while they rewrote my place in the family in hushed tones. The photographer's light flashed briefly in the other corner of the room, a burst of white that faded as quickly as it came. The children laughed at something. Light, unbothered laughter that didn't match the heaviness gathering in my chest. The contrast was almost surreal. One part of the room bathed in warmth and easy joy, the other filled with the cold precision of voices deciding just how much of me they could erase without anyone noticing on paper. But here was the thing they didn't understand. I had lived through years of being half in, half out. I knew what it was to hear my name spoken like an obligation, to be placed at the edges of both tables and photographs, and yet I had never left. Not completely. I was still here, standing on the same floor, breathing the same air, close enough that their words brushed against my skin like frost. They thought they were containing me in those whispering corners, but all they were really doing was showing me how much space I truly took up, because even when they tried to push me out, the air shifted to make room for my presence, and no amount of lowered voices could hide that. It began as a faint murmur at the edges of the room, like the sound of water dripping somewhere you can't see but can't ignore. I wasn't trying to listen. If anything, I was trying not to. But certain words have a way of threading themselves through the air until they land right where they're meant to wound. She hasn't been around much. The voice was casual on the surface, but there was an undercurrent, a thin, gleaming line of judgment running through it. Not an observation, an accusation. Another voice rose just enough to meet the first, softer, but with a certainty that carried. "It's better this way." The words clung to me like frost, coating the inside of my chest with a cold that burned. Better. A single word that can redraw the entire outline of your place in the world. Better without me. Better with the picture trimmed. Better when the edges are clean and the history simplified. I shifted slightly, turning my face toward the tall lamp by the wall, pretending to be studying the lighting setup. In truth, I was straining to catch the next piece. I heard it drop like a stone into the space between their sentences. "Let's not make it awkward." There it was. The excuse that makes cruelty sound like courtesy. Don't make it awkward. Don't risk discomfort. Keep the waters smooth, even if it means leaving someone standing alone on the shore. My jaw tightened so hard I could feel the ache push up into my temples. I fixed my gaze on a single point, a hairline crack in the studio's floorboards, just visible where the rug had shifted. It became a lifeline, something to hold on to so I wouldn't look up and let them see the way their words had hit their mark. I could feel my pulse in my throat, steady but heavy, as though each beat was pushing back against the urge to speak. Around us, life went on. The photographer adjusted her camera settings. The children fussed with scarves and jackets. A heater clicked faintly in the corner. The rest of the family leaned into one another's warmth, arranging themselves in a choreography they had rehearsed over years of being a unit. And me, I stood in the quiet, anchored by the weight of words not meant to be heard, but aimed precisely enough to find me. They thought those whispers kept me small, contained to the edges of the frame. But the truth is, every hushed word only sharpened my outline. In their attempt to keep me out of the story, they had drawn me in more vividly. I wasn't a shadow in the background. I was the unspoken subject. And whether they liked it or not, the photograph they were about to take would never be able to hide that. It came in fragments, drifting across the room like smoke, thin, curling, impossible to catch, but heavy with a scent you can't mistake. I wasn't leaning in, wasn't even close enough to see their mouths move, but the words found me anyway, threading through the quiet, like they had been rehearsed. She hasn't been around much. The syllables were wrapped in the kind of tone that pretends to be factual, but I could hear the subtle triumph under it, the satisfaction of labeling absence as failure. Before I could push the thought away, another voice slid in, low and certain. "It's better this way. Better." The word lodged itself like grit under my skin. Better without me, better when the picture could be neat, better when the history they wanted to show didn't have to accommodate the complications of my presence. I stood still, but the muscles in my shoulders tightened, pulling me in on myself. It wasn't the first time I'd been spoken about as though I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be included. Then came the last piece, almost gentle in its cruelty. "Let's not make it awkward." There it was, the tidy bow that wraps exclusion in civility. They weren't doing this to hurt me, they'd tell themselves. They were protecting the mood, the image, the comfort of everyone else. As if comfort were more sacred than truth. As if my silence were the price of their ease. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, where a narrow beam of light from the window cut across the scuffed wooden boards. I studied the grain, the faint scratches, the places where the varnish had worn away over the years. It gave me something to focus on other than the heat rising in my chest, the slow, deliberate rhythm of my breathing, as I willed my face to stay still. The air between us felt thinner, sharper, like the room itself was holding its breath. In the background, life carried on as if nothing had shifted. The photographer's equipment clicked softly. A child laughed in the far corner. Someone adjusted a scarf in the mirror. And yet, for me, the air was thick with the weight of what had just been said, heavy enough to press against my ribs. They thought those whispers were private, contained, harmless. But the truth was, every word they thought was disappearing into the corners was carving its way into the center of me. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. When people try to erase you in quiet ways, it's not because you don't matter. It's because, to them, you matter too much to leave in the frame without changing the story. And no matter how carefully they tried to cut me out, the picture would always carry my outline. One of them, avoiding my eyes, motioned toward the far edge of the room with a quick, polite gesture, one they probably thought was subtle. Maybe just over there, off to the side, just in case we do some separate shots. The words were wrapped in that thin film of civility that people use when they don't want to admit what they're really saying. You're not part of this one. I moved as they asked, each step deliberate, my shoes making a muted thud on the studio floor. The place they'd pointed to wasn't just the side, it was the wall. The cold, painted brick pressed against my back as I leaned there, the faint texture catching through the fabric of my coat. From here, I had the perfect view of the set, and of them arranging themselves into what they clearly considered the real family photo. The photographer adjusted the lighting, calling out soft instructions. They clustered together easily, touching without hesitation, arms slung around shoulders, hands resting on backs. I watched the way they instinctively knew where to stand, how to lean, who should be in the middle. It was choreography learned over years of repetition, the muscle memory of people who have always been sure of their place. I felt the emptiness of the space between me and them. Not physical space, that was only a few feet, but the kind that you can't cross without an invitation. From where I stood, I could see the faint smile on my son's face as he tilted his head toward someone else's shoulder. The sight made something deep inside me tighten. It wasn't jealousy. It was the quiet ache of knowing that in the frame about to be captured, I would be absent, and that absence would one day be mistaken for truth. The flash went off, a burst of white that lit the whole room for a split second. In that frozen moment, I caught their expressions, polished, warm, unified. It was a look meant for the mantel, for holiday cards, for the kind of history you hang on the wall, and I was outside of it, literally and figuratively. My reflection faintly visible in the glass of a framed photo leaning against the floor by the wall. I was in the room, yet already erased. They didn't look toward me when the camera clicked again. The photographer, though, glanced in my direction between shots. Just for a moment. Her eyes didn't pity me. They measured something, and that fleeting connection told me she knew exactly what she was seeing, that there was another story here, one the pictures they were taking could never fully hide. I stayed where I was, my back to the wall, breathing in the smell of warm lights and old wood. If they thought I would slip quietly out of the room after their real photo was done, they were wrong. I wasn't here to fade. I was here to be impossible to ignore, even from the edges. They were already shifting into place for the big shot, the one that would end up framed over the mantel, mailed in envelopes, posted online with captions about family and togetherness. I watched from my corner as the photographer moved her tripod into position, the weight of her old camera steady in her hands. She adjusted the light once, twice, then stepped back to take her place behind the lens. The chatter in the room softened into that anticipatory hush that comes just before a picture is taken. Shoulders straightened, chins lifted, smiles prepared. The air felt tight, almost brittle, as if everyone was holding it together just long enough for the shutter to click. Then something happened. The photographer raised the camera, peered through the viewfinder, and paused. I could see her finger resting on the shutter button, unmoving. She stayed there for a moment, perfectly still, and then lowered the camera slowly, deliberately. The silence in the room deepened, not from anticipation this time, but from the confusion that rippled outward. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to reach every corner of the studio. "I can't start until everyone is here." She let the words settle for a heartbeat, and then her eyes found me, directly, unwaveringly. It was the kind of gaze that stripped away every polite layer and went straight to the truth. No glancing around the room, no pretending she meant something else. She was calling the absence what it was. In that moment, the air changed. A few people shifted uneasily, as if the ground beneath them had moved. My sister-in-law's face tightened, and I could almost hear the quiet protest forming behind her lips. For me, it was like someone had opened a door I hadn't realized was locked. My spine straightened without my telling it to. I didn't move yet, didn't step forward, didn't speak. But the knowledge that she had said it out loud, in front of everyone, lit something deep in my chest. Around us, no one rushed to fill the silence. The photographer simply stood there, the camera hanging loosely at her side, waiting. It wasn't impatience, it was principle. She wasn't about to take a picture that told a false story, one with a deliberate gap where a person should be. And by locking eyes with me, she was telling me without words that she saw exactly who that missing person was meant to be. I felt every pair of eyes in the room flicker toward me then, some quickly, some reluctantly. The moment stretched long enough for me to hear the hum of the heater, the faint creak of the old floorboards under the weight of their discomfort. And still, the photographer didn't raise her camera again. Not until I was where I was meant to be. The silence after her words felt like a taut rope pulled between every person in the room. You could sense the tension in the small, sharp movements, someone's fingers fidgeting with a sleeve cuff, the quick clearing of a throat, the way one cousin adjusted their stance without taking a step forward. Then, slowly, the resistance began to show itself in motion, a sigh from somewhere in the middle, a hesitant shifting of feet, the faint scrape of shoes against the floor as bodies in the front row edged aside, their reluctance written in every slow inch of space they yielded. I caught it all, the way my sister-in-law's lips pressed together, the sideways glance one relative gave another, the subtle tilt of a head that said, "Let's just get this over with." Someone, under their breath, let slip the words, "Do we have to?" It was quiet, almost swallowed by the shuffle, but it cut through the air like the sharp corner of broken glass. Before I could even decide how to react, the photographer answered for me. Her voice came smooth and controlled, yet unyielding, every syllable resting on an unshakable foundation. "If you want a family photo, yes. No rise in volume, no anger, just certainty, steel wrapped in silk." The statement landed in the center of the room and stayed there. No one argued after that. The shuffling continued, each reluctant step and half-turn creating a narrow but undeniable path for me. It wasn't an invitation, not in the warm sense of the word. It was space carved out by necessity, not generosity. Still it was space, and I intended to take it. I moved forward without hurry, every step deliberate, my eyes fixed on the spot that had just been made in the cluster of bodies. I could feel the faint resistance in the way they shifted, as if the air itself pushed back, reluctant to make room. But I stepped into it anyway, standing tall, my shoulders square, my hands calm at my sides. For the first time since I'd walked into that studio, I was inside their frame, not on the wall, not in the corner, not hovering at the edges, in the picture, in the truth of that moment. And though I could sense the unease rippling around me, I also felt the faint steady weight of the photographer's approval, like a quiet hand at my back. Somewhere deep in me, the knot that had been tightening all morning loosened, just enough to let me breathe. They had made space begrudgingly, but they had made it, and once I was in it, there was no taking it back. The air didn't move at first. It was as if her words, calm, precise, impossible to misinterpret, had frozen the whole room in place. Then somewhere in the middle row, a pair of feet shifted, just a fraction, a reluctant scraping sound against the wooden floor. Another person followed, edging sideways, not meeting my eyes. The movement spread slowly, like a ripple in thick syrup, each adjustment tinged with reluctance, each step a silent protest. I could read it in their bodies. The way someone's shoulders curled slightly inward as I approached. How another turned their head toward the backdrop instead of toward me. They weren't welcoming me in. They were making space because they had been told to, because someone with authority had refused to let the camera lie. And yet, in the choreography of that shuffle, a path appeared. Narrow, hesitant, but real. The mutter came from somewhere off to my left. "Do we have to?" Soft enough to be deniable, but sharp enough to slice through me. It wasn't a question about logistics. It was a statement dressed as reluctance. We don't want to, but we'll endure it if we must. For a heartbeat, my pulse rose in my throat, and the old instinct to step back flickered. But then I remembered. The photographer was still watching. Her presence at the edge of the frame was steady, her gaze unmoving. She answered before I could. "If you want a family photo, yes." The way she said it didn't need volume. It carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime arranging people into the truth, not into the version they thought they wanted. Her voice wrapped itself in a kind of softness that was almost tender, but inside it was iron. It left no space for argument. And so the shuffle continued, slow and unwilling but inevitable. A cousin shifted to the right, an uncle took half a step back, someone in the front row turned just enough to open the line. I walked forward, not quickly, not timidly, each step steady, letting the weight of my presence settle where it belonged. I felt the air change as I crossed that invisible threshold, the one that had kept me pressed to the wall just minutes before. When I reached the gap they had made, I stepped into it fully. My shoulders squared, my spine lengthened, my feet planted. Around me the group reformed, bodies closing the space but not shutting me out. The arrangement was imperfect now, not as neat, not as symmetrical, but it was honest. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint click of the photographer adjusting her focus, the low hum of the heater in the corner. I could feel the unease still radiating from some of them, but it no longer mattered. I was in the frame now, and whether they had shuffled with grace or with gritted teeth, the truth was set. They had made room for me, and the camera would remember it. The photographer lifted her camera again, and this time there was no hesitation. The murmur of discontent that had been swirling through the room only moments ago dissolved into the stillness that precedes a shot. I felt the faint shift of bodies settling into place around me, the collective inhale as everyone prepared their practiced smiles. But I didn't force mine. I let my face stay as it was, calm, steady, unflinching. The flash popped, a sharp burst of white that seemed to suspend the room in midair. For that fraction of a second, the lines between us blurred, not in the sense of unity, but in the way the camera makes everyone equal. The lens doesn't weigh grudges. It doesn't measure who's wanted and who isn't. It records. And in that record, I wasn't pressed against the edge like an afterthought. I was in the second row, directly between two generations, one older, one younger, anchored in the center like I'd been built into the composition from the start. My shoulders squared instinctively, my posture claiming a steadiness I refused to surrender. I could feel the warmth of my niece's sleeve brushing mine on one side, and the faint scent of my father's cologne on the other. The physical proximity didn't erase the cold I knew lingered in some hearts, but it was undeniable proof that I was there, touching the very people who might have preferred I was not. The shutter clicked again, capturing slight shifts in expression, the cousin's tight jaw, the almost smile of an aunt, the fixed brightness in my son's eyes that seemed to flicker when they landed on me. I held my place through it all, breathing evenly, letting the weight of the moment settle into my bones. This wasn't just a photograph. It was a timestamp, a visual record of the day they tried to leave me out and failed. The photographer's movements were efficient, deliberate. She adjusted her stance, tilted the camera a fraction, and took another shot, her eyes flicking to me between clicks. It was as if she were silently making sure I stayed exactly where I was, as if she understood that my position in the frame mattered more than the arrangement of colors or the symmetry of the backdrop. And when the final flash came, I knew something had shifted, not in them, perhaps, but in me. I had been placed in the center by someone else's will, yes, but I had held myself there by my own. And no matter what happened after, These images would bear witness. Someday when the photo hung on a wall or was pulled from an old album, no one could crop me out without leaving an obvious gaping hole. I would be right there, between the ones who came before me and the ones who came after, shoulders squared, impossible to miss. The photographer lowered her camera, studying the group with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. Then she tilted her head slightly, as though something in the composition didn't sit right with her. "Let's do one more," she said, her tone light but decisive, "for balance." The word hung in the air, harmless to those who didn't hear the weight beneath it. But I did. I knew she didn't mean the kind of balance you fix by shifting a chair or angling a shoulder. She meant the kind that restores what has been quietly taken away. She meant truth. There was a faint rustle as people adjusted themselves again, pulling at hems, straightening ties, smoothing down hair. No one protested this time, no mutters, no averted eyes. The resistance that had hummed like a low voltage in the first shot seemed to falter. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the understanding that this wasn't just her photo. It was hers to direct, and her patience had boundaries. Whatever the reason, I felt the difference immediately. The stiffness eased, the sideways glances softened. The collective breath in the room seemed less guarded. I took a step deeper into my space, planting my feet a little more firmly. The backdrop loomed behind us, plain and neutral, but I could feel the gravity of this moment pressing into me. The photographer raised her camera again, and in that instant her eyes met mine over the top of the lens. It was brief but steady, and it felt like a promise. This time they'll see you. The click of the shutter was sharp, clean, final. In this shot, no one looked away. My niece, who had been stiff in the first picture, now stood without leaning away. My son's gaze, for the first time that day, was forward and clear, no flicker of hesitation. Even those who had pulled their bodies subtly from mine in the earlier frame now stood level, their shoulders aligned with mine instead of angling away. I didn't smile, not because I wanted to appear defiant, but because I didn't need to pretend. My expression was calm, anchored, the quiet steadiness of someone who knows the fight is already over. This was the image that would last. This was the version of the day that would be remembered, whether they liked it or not. When the flash faded, I could feel the difference settle in the room. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it was no longer icy. It was as if something unspoken had been acknowledged, like a shift in the ground that no one wanted to name but everyone could feel under their feet. The photographer lowered her camera and gave a small nod, the kind you give when you know you've captured what you came for. I knew it too. That second take wasn't about symmetry or technical perfection. It was about making sure that, in the years to come, when eyes landed on that photo, they would see me not as an afterthought pressed to the edges, but as part of the center, unavoidable, undeniable, exactly where I belonged, When the last flash faded and the photographer stepped back, the room didn't dissolve into the usual easy chatter. Instead, there was a strange stillness, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to declare it over. Slowly, they began to drift toward the photographer's table, where her camera rested, the images glowing faintly on the small screen. The first few leaned in close, murmuring quietly, pointing here and there, their voices low enough to keep their words just beyond reach. I stayed where I was, letting the coat of silence settle over me. But I didn't have to move closer to know what they were seeing. My image was in every shot, not at the edge, not half hidden, not easily trimmed away without leaving an awkward gap, an empty sliver of backdrop where a person should have been. I could imagine the unspoken calculations, how removing me would break the line, skew the symmetry, create a visible wound in the composition. Some looked at the screen too long, their eyes lingering not on the faces they loved, but on mine, as though they were testing the idea of wishing me gone, and realizing it was now impossible. Others gave quick glances, then stepped back, their expressions neutral, almost careful, as if the mere acknowledgement of my place in the picture might set off a chain reaction they weren't prepared to handle. The photographer, in contrast, seemed unbothered by any of it. She scrolled through the images with deliberate slowness, pausing here and there, nodding slightly to herself. When one cousin leaned in and tried to make a comment, something about maybe cropping in tighter, she didn't look up. She simply tapped the edge of the frame on the screen and said, "That's the shot. Everyone's here." Her tone was final. No room for edits, no invitation for revision. I watched their faces as they stepped back from the camera, each of them carrying a slightly different version of the same realization, that no matter what they had planned, the record of this day now told a story they couldn't rewrite. The family photo existed, and in it I was exactly where I had been in the room, centered, grounded, part of the whole. A strange calm settled over me as I picked up my coat. The earlier tension in my chest had loosened, replaced by something quieter, steadier. They could choose how to remember the day in their private thoughts, but the truth was already fixed in pixels and ink. And someday, when those images were printed, framed, and passed from hand to hand, the hole they once wanted to leave would no longer exist, because I had been there to fill it. And no one, not even them, could undo that. Weeks passed before the envelope arrived. It was one of those gray mornings where the sky seemed to press down on the street, the air damp and heavy, the kind that makes you move slower without realizing it. I found it wedged among the usual stack of bills and flyers, but it stood out instantly, thick, cream-colored, with my name written in a hand that was steady and deliberate. There was no return address, only the faint imprint of the studio's logo pressed into the back flap like a quiet signature. I carried it inside and set it on the table, letting my fingers rest on the paper for a moment. It felt heavier than it should, as though whatever was inside carried more than just photographs. I slid a letter opener beneath the flap and felt the crisp tear as it gave way. Inside were the prints, larger than I expected, the colors warm and rich. I pulled the first one free, and there it was, the shot, the second take, the one where no one looked away. My eyes found myself instantly, not because I was straining to, but because I was impossible to miss. There, in the second row, shoulders squared, framed between two generations, part of the story without apology. The others were arranged around me, the symmetry complete, the space whole. Beneath the stack of prints, a smaller piece of thick cardstock slipped out and landed on the table. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same measured, unhurried script I'd seen in the notepad on that day. Just one sentence. Family isn't a lineup, it's who stands in the frame. I sat there for a long time with that card in my hand, my thumb tracing the ink as if it might smudge under the weight of the moment. She hadn't needed to send it. She owed me nothing beyond the photographs I'd paid for, but she had chosen to put those words in my hands, to put in writing what had been silently understood between us in the studio, that the truth of that day wasn't in how they wanted the picture to look, but in the fact that I had been there, unshaken, unremoved. I placed the card back into the envelope, along with the prints, and tucked it in the drawer where I keep things I know I'll return to, because someday someone might try to tell this story differently, might say I wasn't there, or that I'd stepped aside, or that my absence was a choice. And when that day comes, I'll have proof that the frame told another truth, a truth I had stood in fully and claimed as mine. The next holiday came with the same familiar rituals: cars pulling into the driveway, the smell of food thick in the air, the muffled thud of footsteps on the porch before the door swung open to welcome whoever had arrived. I hesitated before stepping inside, bracing myself for the same undercurrent that had always hummed through these gatherings. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw first. Above the fireplace, in its usual place of honor, was the mantelpiece frame. Not just any frame, the one that held the family portrait, the one updated every year like a seasonal crown. This time, it was the photograph from that day, the second take, the one where no one looked away. And there I was, not at the edge, not blurred in the background, but in the second row, centered between two generations, my posture steady and undeniable. For a moment, I simply stood there, coat still on, my breath caught in my throat. The fire crackled below it, sending up small waves of heat, but what I felt was something colder and sharper, recognition, not just of my own face in that frame, but of the fact that someone had chosen to put it there. Someone had looked at that photograph, at all of us together, and decided it would stay whole. No one mentioned it. No one offered an explanation or a word of acknowledgement. Guests moved in and out of the living room, drinks in hand, laughter bouncing off the walls. They passed in front of the mantel without pausing, as if the picture had always been there. But every time I caught sight of it over their shoulders, I saw it for what it was. Proof. Inescapable, fixed, and public. I imagined the quiet decision that must have happened when the prince arrived. The moment someone opened that same envelope, saw my face exactly where the photographer had placed me, and weighed the trouble of removing me against the ease of leaving me there. Maybe it was resignation. Maybe it was some small shift in conscience. Or maybe it was simply that cropping me out would have left too obvious a gap. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. I was part of the picture now, in their home, in their line of sight every day. Anyone who looked up from the sofa or glanced over from the dining table would see me, woven into the fabric of that moment in time. And the longer I stood there in that room, the more I realized that the real victory wasn't just that they had failed to erase me. It was that they had to live with the reminder, framed in wood and glass, watching over every holiday that followed. Years from now, the faces in that photograph will blur in memory, the edges of the frame yellowing with time, the glass catching dust and fingerprints from a dozen careless hands. Some of the people will be gone, their voices only faint echoes in holiday toasts and stories told after dinner. The children, grown and carrying their own lives, will wander past the mantel one day and pause, their eyes catching on that one frozen moment. They'll point, curiosity in their tone, and ask, "Who was she?" The answers will vary. Some will speak in short, safe sentences, leaving out the messier truths. Others will recall fragments, holidays, laughter, maybe even arguments softened by distance. But no one will be able to erase what the picture itself declares. I was there. Not hidden at the edge, not folded out of sight, but standing in the center of a story that, for all their efforts, could not be told without me. They won't know about the tension in the room that day, the whispered corners, the chair quietly removed. They won't hear the words that tightened my jaw, or feel the heat in my chest when I was told to stand off to the side. They won't know about the shuffle, the reluctant space made under the firm eye of a woman with a camera older than some of the faces in front of it. They won't hear the question muttered under someone's breath, "Do we have to?" Or the photographer's answer, "Steel wrapped in silk, if you want a family photo, yes." What they will see is what she made sure of, that the frame told the truth, that one person in that moment refused to let a false picture stand. The justice of it is not in the smiles or the poses, but in the unchangeable fact that the lens found me and refused to let go, that no matter who wished me gone, there I am, unmovable as the wall behind me. And maybe when those children grow older, they'll learn that justice isn't always a verdict in a courtroom or a loud confrontation. Sometimes it's a quiet, deliberate act. A shutter's click, a picture captured whole, a truth printed and hung where everyone can see it. A truth that no one can crop without leaving a jagged hole. That's what I'll leave behind in this family. Not applause, not reconciliation, but permanence. Proof that I existed in the places they tried to bar me from. And long after the voices fade and the stories are rewritten, that photograph will remain. My shoulders squared between two generations, the camera's unblinking eye bearing witness. Because on that day, justice was captured in an instant and framed for a lifetime.